Hello students, so this video is about what happens when there is no oxygen present. So we already know how cellular respiration works when oxygen is the final electron acceptor. We know at the end of the electron transport chain is where most of the ATP energy is made. However, this process of cellular respiration is really conserved in a lot of different organisms. Many cells do this process. And so because of the diversity on Earth, because of a variety of different environmental conditions, there has to be some way to get energy out when oxygen is not present. And that is the focus of this on anaerobic cellular respiration. So first let's talk about those words, aerobic and anaerobic, just so we know what that means. So aerobic has to do with oxygen. So when I think of like aerobics, I think of 80s people like doing their dances and stretching and getting some exercise on. That process has to do with aerobic because the point of doing exercise like that is so you breathe a lot and get a lot of oxygen. So aerobic just has to do with oxygen. So whenever oxygen is available, we know that food, glucose, is broken down through glycolysis, then the Krebs cycle, then the electron transport chain, and lots of energy is made. However, there's a way to get a small amount of ATP energy out of glucose when oxygen is not available. That process is called fermentation. So the glucose is still going to go through the same process of glycolysis that we did in respiration when oxygen is present. However, the products of glycolysis get returned through a process called fermentation. Fermentation is going to look a little different depending on the species of organism that's doing it. In us, in humans, we are going to produce lactic acid as a byproduct, and in a lot of yeast and bacteria and plants, ethanol is made, as well as carbon dioxide. Okay, so that process of fermentation is where all the molecules necessary for glycolysis is restored when there's no oxygen. There's no additional ATP formed, but lactic acid in animals or ethanol and CO2 in plants and many microorganisms like yeast are produced as byproducts. We actually use fermentation as humans for a lot of different things, including a whole lot of foods. So let's look a little bit more closely at this process. So we start with glycolysis. Remember, with glycolysis, you have to put in 2 ATP in order to get the process to go, and you get out 4 ATP. So total, you get a net of 2 ATP. So we see that here where we have our glucose molecule, and with the addition of ATP, we eventually get out to a TP and get some pyruvate out as well. Notice, however, we also have this NAD+, this electron carrier, that has to get charged up to NADH. Normally, after glycolysis, this is going to enter into the mitochondria. It's going to help out in the electron transport chain. However, if there is no oxygen, the mitochondria isn't involved in this at all. Instead, the NADH has to be returned to NAD+ in order for this cycle to continue. And that's the purpose of fermentation. So we see that process. If there's no oxygen present, then at the end of glycolysis, our 2 pyruvate molecules are either going to go through this process of creating lactate, which then turns into lactic acid, or they're going to create carbon dioxide and ethanol. And the purpose of that is just, again, to return that NAD+ so that glycolysis itself can continue working. We use this for a lot of things as humans. So first of all, we do it. We create lactic acid. If you ever work out really hard and you feel the burn, that's what it is. That burn is that your body is using the oxygen so quickly, your cells don't have enough, and so your cells start to go through anaerobic respiration. We also use this process a lot in foods. So there's going to be a lot of organisms, bacteria, yeasts, that are going to help us to create some really common foods. And those processes are just slightly different versions of fermentation. So we see lactic acid is going to help us make some delicious things like cheddar cheese, yogurt, soy sauce. Those are all made through these different bacteria that are doing that process. We also create ethanol. So ethanol is alcohol. And so wine, beer, those are just created by putting some yeast that do that process in an area with no air, with no oxygen. And then as they go through that process, CO2 and ethanol are created. And so not only is this process good for creating more energy, it's also good for creating foods. Okay, so quick review. Fermentation is just used to produce a whole bunch of foods We, as humans, often feel that effect of lactic acid when we're working out, and then fermentation overall produces a net yield of 2 ATP. Okay, so we're actually going to stop there. It's going to be a short video, finally, thinking a little bit about what happens when oxygen is not present. So I want you to go back and put this into context of what happens when oxygen is present, and think about the differences between those two processes. Cellular respiration, either anaerobic, without oxygen, or aerobic, with oxygen. Hope that helps.